The steady hum of jet engines filled the cabin of luxury, a private world drifting above the clouds. Champagne sparkled in crystal glasses, leather seats cradled bodies draped in wealth, and the air smelled faintly of perfume worth more than most monthly salaries. This was a flight reserved for the elite, the rich, the powerful, the untouchable. But sometimes power wears no diamonds. Sometimes strength is dressed in silence. It happened in the blink of an eye. A sharp crack split the air, startling every passenger. Heads turned, gasps erupted, and time seemed to freeze. A flight attendant, her face twisted with arrogance, had struck a black woman across the cheek. A woman, she assumed, didn't belong among the millionaires. A woman she saw as less. What she didn't know, what no one had bothered to ask, was that this woman wasn't just another passenger trying to play at wealth. She wasn't here by accident. She was the owner of the very jet they were flying in, the billionaire who signed their paychecks, who built an empire from the ground up, who carried the kind of strength that no slap could erase. The silence after the slap was louder than thunder. And in that silence, a storm began. One that would shake not just the cabin, but every life inside it. This is not just a story about arrogance meeting its downfall. It is the story of dignity tested, prejudice exposed, and the unshakable fire of a woman who knew her worth even when others refused to see it. Hours earlier, before the slap that would echo like a gunshot, Camille Davenport boarded her private jet. She stepped onto the carpeted stairway with a poise that was both elegant and unassuming. Her tailored navy dress wasn't draped in designer logos, and she carried no entourage to announce her importance. Her jewelry was minimal, a thin gold bracelet, a simple diamond stud in her ear. She didn't need to flaunt her wealth. She was wealth embodied in grace and quiet power, yet to the outside eye, Camille could have been mistaken for anyone. And sometimes she allowed it. It was a strange gift, this ability to disappear into simplicity, to move unseen despite owning empires. The cabin sparkled with extravagance. Velvet seats gleamed, tables bore arrangements of roses, and passengers dripped with arrogance as if it were part of their outfits. Men in pinstriped suits tapped on phones, closing deals worth millions. Women adjusted handbags that cost as much as cars. Influencers pointed cameras at themselves, recording the illusion of perfection for followers who could never touch such luxury. Camille found her seat quietly, sliding into the leather embrace with calm composure. She wasn't here to impress them. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was here because she could be, because this sky, this flight, this plane was hers. The crew moved briskly through the aisle. Attendants poured champagne into glasses that never emptied. They bent low for the passengers who barked orders without looking them in the eye. Camille noticed how quickly smiles appeared for shore passengers, smiles dripping with practiced servitude. But when their eyes turned to her, those smiles faltered. Marissa, the lead flight attendant, was sharp in her movements, crisp in her uniform, and sharper still in her judgments. She spotted Camille instantly, and the faint downturn of her lips said more than words could. It wasn't just disapproval, it was dismissal. Camille raised a hand politely. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Marissa's eyes narrowed as though the request itself were out of place. "I'll get to you when I can," she replied, voice flat, her tone meant for Camille alone. Yet nearby passengers overheard. A smirk tugged at one man's lips. A woman in pearls whispered, "Bold of her to even ask." Camille folded her hands in her lap, the sting of the moment sliding off her like rain. She had lived through worse. She had walked into boardrooms where every eye doubted her. She had signed contracts where every hand hesitated to shake hers. A glass of water withheld on her own jet? That was barely a breeze compared to the storms she had conquered. But storms, no matter how small, have a way of growing. The engines roared, lifting the jet into the vast blue. Below them, the city shrank into glittering lights. Above them stretched endless skies. Yet inside, within this palace of wealth, the air was thick with something invisible yet suffocating. Prejudice. Whispers began like cracks in ice. "Who is she?" one passenger asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "She doesn't look like she belongs here." Another chuckled. "Maybe she won a ticket." Camille's eyes drifted to the window. her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had promised herself long ago never to waste energy on every ignorant remark. But even silence had its limits. The hours stretched. Champagne flowed for others, while her simple request for water took an eternity. Platters of food circulated, but her plate was the last to be filled, as though the air around her diminished her existence. Marissa smiled at others, leaned warmly into their requests, and even laughed at their jokes. But when her eyes landed on Camille, they grew colder than the air outside the cabin. Camille felt it all, the deliberate delays, the sting of whispers, the subtle mockery. Yet her posture never shifted. She sat straight, composed, regal in her stillness. If they thought she didn't belong, let them. She had nothing to prove. Still, prejudice, once unchecked, rarely stays hidden. It grows, it spreads, it searches for a breaking point. And before this flight touched the ground, it would find one. The silence that followed the slap was so sharp, it cut through the hum of the engines like a blade. Time itself seemed suspended in the cabin. For a heartbeat, all that existed was the image of Camille's face, stung and reddened, and the frozen posture of the flight attendant who had delivered the blow. Camille's hand lingered against her cheek, trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the flood of emotions storming inside her. The first to react was an older man seated across the aisle. His jaw dropped as he leaned forward, his eyes bulging with outrage. "Did I just see what I think I saw?" he whispered hoarsely to his wife. She clutched his sleeve, shaking her head in disbelief, but the truth was undeniable. A flight attendant, a representative of hospitality and professionalism, had just struck a passenger. And not just any passenger, but a poised woman who carried herself with an air of quiet dignity. Camille inhaled slowly, her composure balancing on the edge of shattering. Inside, memories stirred. The countless times people had underestimated her, spoken down to her, assumed her value was less because of her skin, her gender, or the assumptions attached to her presence. But never had she been humiliated so publicly, and on her own jet no less. She looked at the attendant, who still stood rigid, her face pale, her lips trembling as though the reality of what she had done was sinking in. Camille's eyes, sharp, deep, unflinching, locked on hers. That gaze alone was enough to send a chill down the woman's spine. Another attendant rushed forward, her hands raised as if to calm the storm before it erupted. "Please, please, let's all remain calm," she stammered. "This must be a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding? Camille's voice, though steady, carried the weight of centuries of silenced voices demanding to be heard. "You think striking someone across the face can be brushed away as a misunderstanding?" Her words echoed through the cabin. Several passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Some looked away, unwilling to be part of the unfolding confrontation, while others leaned in, sensing they were witnessing something unforgettable. The captain, alerted by the murmur through the intercom system, stepped out of the cockpit. His presence commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the authority of decades in the sky. His sharp eyes scanned the tense scene. "What is happening here?" His voice was calm, but carried a steel edge. The guilty flight attendant finally found her voice, though it cracked as she spoke. She was being difficult. She questioned my instructions. I lost my temper." Camille's brows arched, her lips pressing into a firm line. She let the silence stretch before replying, her voice low but devastatingly precise. "You lost your temper." "On a passenger. In the skies, where professionalism is not just a standard but a responsibility. And you think that excuse is raising your hand to me?" The attendant swallowed hard, her body trembling. The captain's gaze hardened. "Is this true?" he asked her directly. She nodded faintly, tears beginning to blur her eyes. Whispers spread like wildfire among the passengers. Some reached for their phones, ready to record, sensing the drama was about to explode into something larger than themselves. Camille noticed the lenses trained on her but didn't flinch. She understood the power of narrative, of how quickly the world judged by what went viral. But unlike others who might shrink under such a spotlight, she straightened her posture, drawing strength from her pain. If this moment were to be shared, she would ensure it told the truth. the truth of what it meant to endure injustice and still rise above it. "I am not a woman who seeks trouble," Camille continued, her voice steady, carrying to every corner of the cabin. "But I will not allow myself or anyone else to be treated as less than human. Today you struck me. Tomorrow, who will it be? The elderly? A child? How many others must bear the sting of your unchecked temper?" Gasps rippled through the passengers. Some nodded in agreement, emboldened by her courage. Others exchanged uneasy glances, knowing the atmosphere in the jet had shifted permanently. The captain exhaled heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. He turned to Camille, his tone respectful. "Madam, I apologize on behalf of the crew. This is unacceptable. Rest assured she will be relieved of duty immediately." Camille tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Relieved of duty? Do you think dismissal alone erases the harm done?" The captain hesitated. His authority in the air was absolute, but something about Camille's presence unsettled him. She carried herself not as an ordinary passenger, but as someone who expected and demanded accountability. And yet, he still didn't know who she was. The humiliated flight attendant finally broke down, her tears spilling freely. "I didn't know," she whispered desperately. "I didn't know you were—" Camille's gaze cut like a knife. "Didn't know I was what? Important? Wealthy? Powerful?" The woman's voice faltered. "Didn't know you were the owner," and just like that, the truth hung heavy in the air. Murmurs erupted. The passengers' eyes widened, their curiosity snapping into shock. The attendants looked at one another, their faces drained of color. Even the captain stood frozen, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. The owner? The billionaire who owned the very plane they stood in? The realization hit like thunder. And the rising action of this story was no longer just about a slap. It was about a world of assumptions crumbling, about arrogance exposed, about power rediscovered in the hands of the one underestimated. Camille remained silent for a long moment, letting the revelation sink in. Then, with calm authority, she spoke words that would mark the turning point of the entire journey. "You struck me, not knowing who I was. That says more than you realize, because respect should never depend on wealth, status, or ownership. Respect is owed to every human being who walks this earth." The cabin, once buzzing with whispers, fell silent again. Not out of fear this time, but out of awe. For Camille's rising action wasn't just about reclaiming her dignity. It was about holding up a mirror to everyone present, forcing them to confront the biases they carried, the quiet injustices they ignored. The storm was building, and the climax was yet to come. The revelation hung in the cabin like a lightning bolt frozen mid-air. Camille, the woman dismissed, disrespected, and slapped, was not merely a passenger, she was the billionaire owner of the very jet they were flying on. The guilty flight attendant collapsed into her seat, her face buried in her hands. The other crew members shifted uncomfortably, their bodies tense, as though they were standing on the edge of a cliff. The captain, once confident in his command of the skies, suddenly seemed small, his authority shaking beneath the weight of his ignorance. The passengers, meanwhile, whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting from Camille to the trembling attendant. What had started as a cruel act of arrogance was now unraveling into something far larger, an unmasking of prejudice, of assumptions, of the fragile lines between respect and disrespect, power and servitude. Camille rose slowly from her seat. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, yet effortless, like a queen reclaiming her throne after being betrayed in her own court. Her gaze swept across the cabin, meeting the eyes of each passenger, each crew member, lingering long enough to ignite discomfort, guilt, or awe in their hearts. She spoke at last, her voice calm but ringing with steel. "All of you saw what happened. You saw how quickly judgment was passed on me. Not by who I was, but by who you thought I was. A seat number, a skin color, a presence you couldn't place in your assumptions of power. And because of that, I was treated with contempt, with hostility, with violence." Her words reverberated like thunder rolling across the skies. "You struck me," she said, her eyes locked on the attendant. "But the deeper wound is not on my skin. It is in the arrogance that allowed you to believe I was less deserving of respect." The attendant sobbed uncontrollably, her pleas breaking through the thick silence. "Please, I didn't know. I didn't realize." Camille's eyes softened, but only slightly. And that is the tragedy. Because respect should not require realization, it should not depend on wealth or ownership. A human being, no matter who they are, deserves dignity. Deserves dignity. The cabin fell silent again. But this time the silence was alive, electric, heavy, pressing down on everyone like the weight of a storm cloud about to burst. The captain stepped forward cautiously, his voice trembling with the effort to reclaim control. "Miss Camille, madam, please understand, we never intended—" Camille raised her hand and he stopped mid-sentence. The gesture was not loud, but it carried more command than his uniform ever could. "I don't need excuses, Captain," she said firmly. "I need accountability." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some nodded, emboldened by her strength. One young man whispered, "She's right. This isn't just about her, it's about all of us. If this can happen to her, what about the rest of us?" Camille turned slightly toward him, her gaze softening. "Exactly. This is bigger than me. It's about how easily we strip dignity from others when we think they have no power to fight back." Her words landed like arrows, piercing through the thin veils of indifference. The passengers leaned in, drawn not just to her authority but to her truth. She was no longer merely defending herself. She was standing as a voice for everyone who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or silenced. The guilty attendant finally rose shakily to her feet, her tears streaking her face. She clasped her trembling hands together. "Please, forgive me. I will resign. I will leave this career. I don't deserve it." Camille studied her for a long, heavy moment. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her verdict. Would she punish her? Ruin her life the way she had tried to ruin Camille's dignity? Or would she show mercy? The climax demanded its answer. At last, Camille spoke, her words deliberate and sharp. "You are right. You don't deserve the uniform if you cannot carry the respect it demands. But your punishment will not be to disappear. Your punishment will be to learn, to confront yourself, your biases, and the people you've harmed. Walking away spares you. Facing these changes you." The attendant crumpled, her sobs louder now, but beneath them was something else. Acceptance. Camille turned back to the captain. "As for you, Captain, you let this happen on your watch. You let your crew's arrogance outweigh their duty. A ship, whether on sea or sky, reflects its captain." The man swallowed hard, shame washing over his once proud face. "You have a choice," Camille said, her voice quiet but commanding. "Dismiss me as an angry woman, or recognize this moment for what it is, a chance to change." The climax of her words broke through the fear in the passengers. Applause erupted, slow at first, then building into a rolling wave that filled the cabin. Not applause of entertainment, but of solidarity, of awakening. Some stood to their feet, clapping. Others shouted, "That's right! Respect is for everyone!" The once tense jet was now alive with voices that refused to be silent. The captain bowed his head, defeated but enlightened. "You are right, madam, I failed today. We all failed today. But I will not let this moment pass unlearned." The roar of applause grew louder. The guilty attendant, broken yet listening, wiped her tears and nodded faintly, as though realizing her shame was not the end, but perhaps the beginning of redemption. And through it all, Camille stood firm, her presence commanding yet graceful, her words blazing yet healing. She had turned humiliation into revelation, disrespect into revolution. The climax had arrived, and with it, the undeniable truth that the one underestimated was the one holding the power all along. The applause still echoed in Camille's ears long after it had quieted. For a moment, the cabin felt transformed. What had begun as a place of humiliation had turned into a courtroom of truth, where justice had been spoken, not through anger, but through wisdom and courage. But as the cheers faded into silence, the reality of what came next pressed itself into the air. They were still mid-flight, high above the clouds, and though the confrontation had peaked, The story was not yet finished. The passengers settled back into their seats, some whispering fervently, others staring at Camille with new respect, as though they were in the presence of someone more than human. The guilty flight attendant remained seated, trembling, staring down at her hands as if they carried the weight of her disgrace. Camille exhaled slowly, releasing the tension that had gripped her chest. Her words had carried power, but her heart was still bruised from the sting of the slap, from the reminder that even in her triumphs, she was not immune to the wounds of prejudice. Yet she knew the power of turning wounds into weapons of light. The captain returned to the cockpit, his face solemn, his silence heavier than any words could be. His co-pilot glanced at him but said nothing, sensing the captain's thoughts were locked in reflection. He had been humbled in front of his passengers, in front of his crew, and most of all, in front of the woman who owned the very wings he commanded. Camille remained standing in the aisle, her presence unshakable. She looked toward the passengers. "This moment," she said, her voice softer now but still strong, "cannot remain only in this cabin. Each of you has witnessed it. Each of you has seen how fragile respect becomes when it is tied to assumptions instead of humanity. I ask you to carry this with you beyond this flight. Let it change the way you look at others." The elderly man from earlier nodded, his voice trembling as he replied, "You've given us more than a journey today." "Madam, you've given us truth." Others murmured their agreement, some with tears shining in their eyes. They had come aboard expecting nothing more than a flight, but they would disembark with a story etched into their souls. As the hours passed and the jet cut steadily through the night sky, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The fear had dissolved, the tension melted away, and in its place, something deeper had taken root. Reflection. Passengers stared out of the oval windows, their minds far beyond the clouds, replaying Camille's words, her poise, her courage. Finally, the captain's voice broke through the intercom, steady yet subdued. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please prepare for descent." The landing was smooth, but as the wheels kissed the runway, the weight of what awaited them on the ground stirred. Camille knew that word of what had happened might already be spreading. Several passengers had recorded snippets of her confrontation. By the time she stepped off her own plane, the world could already be watching. The cabin doors opened, and sunlight poured in like a flood. The passengers disembarked one by one, some stopping to thank Camille personally. A young woman pressed her hand to her heart and whispered, "You made me believe I can speak up too." A father with his son paused, his eyes wet. "I want him to grow up in a world where what you said today is true." Camille accepted their words with grace, but her focus remained sharp. She had not sought this moment, yet it had found her. And with it came a responsibility she could not ignore. The guilty flight attendant approached hesitantly, her eyes red from crying. She looked as though she carried centuries of regret in her frail frame. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I know I can never undo what I did. I disrespected you. I disrespected myself, and I disrespected this uniform. But I want to change. I don't ask for forgiveness. I ask for the chance to prove I can be better." Camille studied her for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Change is not words. It is actions. If you are sincere, you will show it in how you treat every soul you meet from this day forward. Not because they might own the jet, not because they might hold power, but because they are human. That is where respect begins." The attendant nodded, tears falling freely again. She did not know if she would ever see Camille again, but the words had cut into her soul like seeds planted in deep soil. Perhaps one day they would grow. As Camille stepped onto the tarmac, flashes exploded in the distance. Journalists had already gathered, their cameras raised like weapons of light. Passengers' recordings had already spread, igniting a firestorm across social media. Headlines scrolled across screens. Billionaire struck by her own flight attendant, responds with dignity and power. But Camille did not flinch. She walked with calm poise, her chin lifted, her steps steady. She had faced humiliation and turned it into a revelation. She had faced disrespect and transformed it into revolution. Later, in interviews, when asked what she had felt in that moment, Camille spoke the truth. "I felt the sting of disrespect, but I also felt the strength of every person who has ever been dismissed, ignored, or silenced. In that cabin, I did not just speak for myself. I spoke for them." Her words spread, reaching far beyond the passengers who had witnessed the scene firsthand. Around the world, people who had endured prejudice felt a spark of recognition, a surge of courage. Social feeds swelled with stories from those who had been disrespected and found hope in Camille's stand. The guilty attendant resigned her post, but carried Camille's words like a burden and a beacon. She sought counseling. She volunteered. She confronted the biases she had buried inside herself. Though her career had ended in shame, her life took on new meaning, shaped by the lessons she had once resisted but now embraced. The captain instituted new training for his crews, not just in safety and procedures, but in dignity and respect. His voice, once commanding through rank alone, now carried the weight of humility. And Camille? She returned to her world of boardrooms and investments, where she focused on strategies and negotiations. Yet something within her had shifted too. She realized that her power was not in the billions she owned, but in the truth she carried. The slap that was meant to demean her had instead reminded her, and the world, that respect is not earned by wealth, but deserved by humanity. Her story became legend, a tale retold not just in business circles but in everyday conversations, of the billionaire who owned the plane, the woman who was slapped, and the truth that changed everyone aboard. And in quiet moments, Camille would touch her cheek, not to remember the sting of the slap, but to remember the strength that followed. The impact was not pain, it was transformation. The resolution was not revenge, it was awakening. Because, in the end, respect is not about titles, wealth, or ownership. Respect is the one currency that every human being deserves equally, and that, above all, was the legacy Camille left behind.